Welcome to Your Soul Rising. In this video, I lecture through Book 5 of the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. Subscribe to the channel if you are new. Even though it's free, your subscription helps this community learn and grow together. And if you enjoy the video, hit the like button and the bell icon so you get notified when a new video drops. As always, before we get started, get cozy, grab a blanket, a warm drink, and let's see how the Consolation of Philosophy comes to a close. Boethius, though lifted by philosophy's teachings and no longer lost in the bitterness of despair, still holds a final question in his heart, a question that pierces to the core of human freedom and divine governance. If providence sees and governs all things, and if God's foreknowledge is infallible, then how can there be free will? If the future is already known by God and cannot be otherwise, how can we be truly free in our choices? And if we are not free, then how can we be held accountable? How can reward or punishment be just? Philosophy does not dismiss the question, but rather welcomes it. It is, she says, the hardest and most subtle of all problems. It is perhaps no coincidence, then, that Book 5 is the most philosophically heavy of the 5 books. As we'll see, it is rather dense with argument after argument, and not so much the prose and artistry of the previous books. Even the most wise have struggled with this problem, but she insists that it can be understood if we are willing to look beyond appearances and into the deeper nature of time, knowledge, and the soul. She begins by reaffirming that human beings do have free will. If they did not, no one could ever pursue virtue or be held responsible for vice. Laws, praise, blame, counsel, all would be meaningless. The soul would be a mere puppet, but everything in our experience testifies to the reality of choice. We deliberate, we struggle, we strive. These motions are not illusions. They are signs of genuine inner agency. Still, Boethius presses his point. How can freedom coexist with divine foreknowledge? If God sees the future with perfect clarity, and if he cannot be wrong, then doesn't that mean our choices are already fixed? Doesn't God's knowledge make the future necessary? She answers with a crucial distinction. Foreknowledge is not the same as causation. Just because God knows what will happen does not mean he causes it to happen. Think of a man standing on a hill who sees travelers approaching from far away. He sees their path, but he does not force their steps. Likewise, God's foreknowledge of future events does not compel them. We still choose, even though he sees our choices in advance. But that does not satisfy Boethius. Even if foreknowledge doesn't cause the future, it still seems to make the future certain. And what is certain cannot be otherwise, so how can we still speak of genuine freedom? So here philosophy introduces her most subtle and powerful insight. The difference between human knowledge, which is bound by time, and divine knowledge, which is eternal, which we should read as transcendent of time, rather than something like immortality, where one is still within time, but goes on infinitely. She explains that God does not exist in time the way that we do. For us, time is a sequence, past and present, future. We know the past, we perceive the present, and we anticipate the future. But God's mode of knowing is not like ours. He exists in the eternal present, not a stretched out duration, but a total and unchanging now. He sees all things, past, present, and future, as present to him. So he actually does not foresee in the way a prophet predicts. He simply sees, immediately and completely. What appears to us as future is to him simply known as it is, not because it is predetermined, but because it is already present to his eternal vision. Just as we see a person making a choice in the moment without forcing that choice, so he sees all choices from his perspective outside of time. His knowledge includes our free will and does not eliminate it. This understanding obviously transforms the question. The problem arises only because we try to imagine divine knowledge as if it were just a more powerful version of human foreseeing. But it's not. In fact, many of the paradoxes and problems that people have about God are because they do something similar. They imagine him in an anthropomorphic way, bringing the transcendent into time, into space, into human kinds of action. But God is fundamentally different. Non-temporal, immediate, total. So this does not conflict with freedom. Rather, it contains freedom, as light contains color, or as the transcendent, in some sense, contains the immanent. And so philosophy resolves the apparent contradiction. God's providence and human free will are not enemies. Providence orders all things from above, seeing how even free choices fit into the total harmony. Fate governs the unfolding of events in time, but the soul is not its prisoner. The soul, made in the image of divine reason, possesses a will that can choose the good, and in choosing, it writes its part in the great music of the cosmos. So philosophy ends not with dogma, but with the encouragement that she has been building to throughout the Consolation of Philosophy. She urges Boethius to lift his vision, to see himself not as a victim of fate, but as a participant in a divine order that transcends time. Though he cannot understand all things from his limited vantage point, he can trust that all is known, all is ordered, and all is governed by the capital G, good. And so, with this final insight, the dialogue concludes, not with external deliverance, but interior liberation. Boethius, though he's still in prison, has been freed from the tyranny of fear, from the confusion of injustice, and from the despair of a meaningless world. He now sees that the universe is not a chaos of blind forces and chance, fortune and misfortune, but rather a harmony, intelligible, purposeful, and filled with grace. And so this is the consolation. Even in suffering, the soul can choose to turn toward harmony. Even in darkness, it can remember the light. The consolation of philosophy is not that life ever becomes easy, but that truth is real, and the soul, when it remembers what it is, can never be truly imprisoned. All right, that was the summary of Book 5, and now we'll go through chapter by chapter, and I'll take you through passages that I marked in my notes. Starting off with Chapter 1, Lady Philosophy gives us another reminder that determinism is not true. Randomness is not true. She says, if chance is defined as an event produced by random motion without any causal nexus, I would say that there is no such thing as chance, and that apart from signifying the subject matter of our discussion, it is a completely meaningless word. It's a true maxim that nothing comes out of nothing. None of the ancients denied it, although they used it as an axiom of their natural philosophy, with special reference to material objects, not efficient causes. If something does happen for no cause, it obviously arises out of nothing. But if this is impossible, it is impossible, too, for there to be chance of the kind we have just defined. So the first thing to notice is that Book 5, as I said in the summary, is more just straight-ahead, hard-nosed philosophical argumentation. This is where the rubber meets the road, and as Lady Philosophy promised us way back in the beginning, we are now far from the easy treatments that she gave him back when he was still in a very feeble mental state. Now that he's stronger, now that she's built him up, she's going to give him the hard medicine. And so we see her here appeal to the PSR, the principle of sufficient reason. Everything must have a reason or an explanation for its existence. Now, of course, this fails at the paradigm or meta level, and that's where you need God to step in. You need something transcendent of all cause to be the primitive, the one entity of the reduction base, so to speak. In other words, to be fundamental. This is in contrast to something like physicalism or materialism, which is the philosophy of the illusion. In those philosophies, everything is accidental rather than intentional, and there is nothing transcendent. It's just brute force existence of a multiplicity of physical entities, and each one follows the principle of sufficient reason, but it's a determined accidental cause and effect chain. And there's nothing to actually start it or ground it. And so in response to her, Boethius goes after this very question. He says, isn't there anything which can be properly called chance or accidental? She then gives him an Aristotelian view of this. She says, whenever something is done for some purpose, and for certain reasons something other than what was intended happens, it is called chance. For example, if someone began to dig the ground in order to cultivate a field and found a cache of buried gold, this is believed to have happened fortuitously, but it does not happen as a result of nothing. It has its own causes, the unforeseen and unexpected conjunction of which have clearly affected the chance event. And so essentially what she's saying here is that chance is actually coincidence. It surprises us because we don't have the perspective that is high enough to know all of the circumstances of the two things that have come into coincidence. But there are certainly causes behind the two streams of circumstance that have now met. Now, I quite like this because even though science still sometimes discusses the possibility of randomness, especially these days in things like quantum mechanics, it usually turns out that that randomness isn't actually the case. It's just a place where our scientific ignorance still remains, and we just don't have a high enough perspective yet to know all of the causes and mechanisms at play. Of course, from a metaphysical perspective that is transcendent and inclusive of science, you still need a transcendental ground of being. Otherwise, none of those causes, none of that chain of cause and effect, that determined, that accidental, whatever we want to call it, none of that actually has an ontological grounding, let alone one that can be epistemically justified. That is beyond the scope of what Lady Philosophy needs to convince Boethius of, however. She is simply articulating the point that there is no such thing as blind, accidental chance. And so we get some poetry at the end, of course, and she uses the example of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to demonstrate coincidence. In other words, two streams that meet, and humans respond accordingly. In the case of the poem, she says that humans bring their ships to where these two rivers meet. But even though humans do that, they don't necessarily know or even care all of the different twists and turns that the two rivers took in order to get to that point of coincidence. Well, that's all well and good, but as Boethius points out in the first lines of chapter 2, that still doesn't give an account for how there could be freedom of the will in a world of these chains of close-knit causes. So this brings us kind of to where the free will debate is even today, particularly online. That is reality purely deterministic, or is there free will in some sense? Lady Philosophy says, there is freedom, for it would be impossible for any rational nature to exist without it. Whatever by nature has the use of reason has the power of judgment to decide each matter. It can distinguish by itself between what to avoid and what to desire. But man pursues what he judges to be desirable, and avoids that which he thinks undesirable. So that those creatures who have an innate power of reason also have the freedom to will or not to will, though I do not claim that this freedom is equal in all. Celestial and divine beings possess clear-sighted judgment, uncorrupted will, and the power to effect their desires. Human souls are of necessity more free when they continue in the contemplation of the mind of God, and less free when they descend to bodies, and less still when they are imprisoned in earthly flesh and blood. They reach an extremity of enslavement when they give themselves up to wickedness and lose possession of their proper reason. So here we see a very Platonic argument for free will, that is, that reason requires freedom, and man's loss of freedom always stems from his ignorance of his divine nature of his soul, and this leads him to vice and passion, and these rule him unconsciously. So this is very consistent with the kind of Hellenic reverence for the intellect, for reason. I will say that today this would not pass as a compelling argument for free will, but it is an interesting little historical snapshot of the world that Boethius is coming from and still inhabiting. Interestingly, several of the church fathers of Christianity write about purifying the heart and the nous. And so as you purify the heart, the nous, or the noetic sense, is able to perceive more accurately. And this kind of parallels what Lady Philosophy described there, that different people have different capacities of freedom depending on how close they have remained to the mind of God versus how far they have fallen into the material illusion. So this is a theme that maybe starts out as Platonic, but certainly found its way into Christianity. And once again, we see Boethius representing both sides of that. Except this time it's actually quite resonant, unlike some of the other occasions we've seen in past books, where he has had one foot in one world and one in the other, and they didn't necessarily always play nice. She goes on to say, "This is visible to the eye of Providence as it looks out at all things from eternity, and arranges predestined rewards according to each man's merit." And then a little further down to close the poetry at the end of the chapter, "What is, what was, what is to be, in one swift glance his mind can see. All things by him alone are seen, and him the true sun we should deem." So here we get the introduction of the idea that I mentioned in the summary, that man does indeed have freedom, but the divine still rules with providence, and predestines rewards, lessons, things of that nature. But even the best of men, even the wisest, can't see what God sees. And so it is here, this difference of levels, the transcendent versus the immanent, the contingent, that which is within time. That distinction is what causes the question of whether or not we have free will, even though God has perfect foreknowledge. As we said in the summary, it's not that he actually has foreknowledge, because that implies time, but he is completely unbound by time in every sense. And so now the dialogue takes us in that direction. As Boethius says, "If God foresees all things and cannot be mistaken in any way, what Providence has foreseen as a future must happen. So that if from eternity Providence foreknows not only men's actions, but also their thoughts and desires, there will be no freedom of will. No action or desire will be able to exist other than that which God's infallible providence has foreseen. For if they can be changed and made different from how they were foreseen, there will be no sure foreknowledge of the future, only an uncertain opinion. And this I do not think can be believed of God." So indeed, in chapter 3, Boethius essentially gives his objections, and they essentially come down to, how can we have free will if God has perfect foreknowledge, which it seems he must do, being God? And of course, doesn't that mean that there's a kind of retro-causality going on here, where God's foreknowledge causes us to do certain things, causes reality to behave in certain ways, otherwise he couldn't know them. Now, having heard my summary already, you can see how his objection here would place God within time, rather than acknowledging that he is transcendent of space, time, even existence itself. This is something that I find kind of funny in Christian and atheist debates today, is they both argue over whether God exists or not. But actually, traditional Christianity would say he doesn't. He is transcendent of existence, because existence is a concept that requires an opposite, a dual, being non-existence. So while you can use the terms like God is absolute being or absolute non-being, they only point to transcendence. They are still just representations in language, however, and that's why Christianity has apophasis, the apophatic theology, where eventually you can only say what God is not. That is a hallmark of having a transcendent ground of being. And so here we see in this free will debate one of the problems and paradoxes that arises if you forget that transcendent, immanent distinction. But Boethius continues on. The question is, therefore, how can God foreknow that these things will happen if they are uncertain? If he thinks that they will inevitably happen while the possibility of their non-occurrence exists, he is deceived, and this is something wicked both to think and to say. But if his knowledge that they will happen as they do is of such a kind that he knows they may as equally not happen, what sort of knowledge is this, which comprehends nothing sure or stable? And furthermore, a little bit further down, he says, once this has been admitted, the extent of the disruption of human affairs is obvious. In vain is reward offered to the good and punishment to the bad, because they have not been deserved by any free and willed movement of the mind. That which is now judged most equitable, the punishment of the wicked and reward of the good, will be seen to be the most unjust of all, for men are driven to good or evil, not by their own will, but by the fixed necessity of what is to be. Neither vice nor virtue will have had any existence, but all merit will have been mixed up and undifferentiated. Nothing more wicked can be conceived than this, for as the whole order of things is derived from providence, and there is no room for human thoughts, it follows that our wickedness, too, is derived from the author of all good. It is pointless, therefore, to hope for anything or pray to escape anything. What can a man hope for, or pray to escape, when an inflexible bond binds all that can be wished for? And so the one and only means of communication between man and God is removed, that is, hope and prayer. If indeed we do obtain, for the price of due humility, the inestimable return of divine grace. And this is the only way by which it seems men can talk with God and join themselves to that inaccessible light before they obtain it, by means of supplication. And if admitting the necessity of future events means believing that hope and prayer have no power, what way will there be left by which we can be joined and united to that supreme Lord of the world? Now, as you can tell, this is what he thinks is a very devastating critique, and it's personal to him because of that section about reward for the good and punishment for the wicked. He has obviously been done severe injustice, as we've covered in the previous books. And so he's saying here that, well, if God has this foreknowledge, then everything must be determined, and therefore it's not really anybody's fault if they do good or bad, and doesn't that render every argument that we've made in the book so far completely and utterly meaningless? Essentially, it's a bit of a crisis here at the end of the book, where we've called into question absolutely every argument that Lady Philosophy has given just on this one paradox. It's so bad that it would even seem to remove prayer and hope. There's actually no way to ask God for assistance because everything is already determined. You just have to kind of go along for the ride of your fate if reality is this way. Or so Boethius is arguing. So again, the issue here is if our actions are predestined, they are in some sense determined, and thus we can't be responsible for them. Yet there seem to be rewards and punishments. And doesn't that make God incredibly unfair and tyrannical, creating a system in which we can't do anything except what we're fated, and yet we get punished for what we do? The poem that concludes this chapter gives us a bit of a musing on this, and it's very Platonic. Speaking of the mind, he says, "Why burns it then with love so great to learn the secret signs of truth? Perhaps it knows already what it seeks to learn. But who still seeks to learn things that he knows? And if the mind knows not, what does it then in blindness seek? For who could search in ignorance for anything? Or who could look for that which was unknown to him? And where could he discover it? When found, could ignorance discern the hidden form? When once the mind beheld the mind of God, did it both some and separate truths perceive? now hidden in the body's density, it does not lose all memory of itself. The many separate truths are lost, yet still it holds the sum. Therefore, who seeks the truth, in neither state will be. He does not know, and yet he is not wholly ignorant. So he reflects upon the sum retained, and kept in mind, and thinks of what on high he saw, that he may add the parts forgot to that which he retains. So this passage evokes again the Platonic concept of the amnesia of the soul, and that learning here in the earth realm is actually the soul remembering things that it knew pre-incarnation. What's interesting to me here from a literary standpoint is that, as you could probably tell while I was reading that, there's kind of lots of disjointed lines here, where there's a line break in the middle of a sentence at a very awkward place. And so I think this kind of parallels Boethius's mental state here again in that kind of crisis point I talked about a second ago. Then in chapter 4, we get Lady Philosophy's reply. And I love how kind of simple and straightforward it is. She goes right to the heart of the matter. She says, "This is an old complaint about providence," which kind of diffuses some of his crisis and the freneticism of the last book right away. She says, "The reason for this blindness is that the operation of human reasoning cannot approach the immediacy of divine foreknowledge. If this immediacy could be understood by some means, all uncertainty would be removed." The implication, though, is that it cannot. And so we get here that same apophatic attitude. There's this creator-creation distinction. And so, like Job, we will never actually be able to grasp everything that God knows and sees from his place transcendent of time. Our concern and the seeming philosophical paradox results from the fact that we think we can understand this, and in a sense, because we can't, we try to bring God down to the level that we could understand, but this leads to all kinds of other paradoxes, trying to bring that which is transcendent down into the creation which is contingent and immanent. Then we get some more arguments for her position here. The first one can be summarized as, "Just as the knowledge of present things imposes no necessity on what is happening, so foreknowledge imposes no necessity on what is going to happen." So essentially this boils down to each present moment is a past future event that did not occur out of necessity just because we now know it. So in other words, this might get a little tricky to describe, but each present moment was a future. Now it is no longer a future. That future is now past because it is present. And so just because we now know what that future moment became in the present doesn't mean it had to be that way. It just is that way, and now we know it. She goes on to say, "There seems to be a contradiction here, and you think that the necessity of events is consequent upon their being foreseen. Well, if there is no necessity, they cannot be foreknown, because you believe that nothing can be comprehended by knowledge unless it is certain. If events of uncertain occurrence are foreseen as if they were certain, it is only clouded opinion, not the truth of knowledge. For you believe that to have opinions about something which differ from the actual facts is not the same as the fullness of knowledge. The cause of this mistake is that people think that the totality of their knowledge depends on the nature and capacity to be known of the objects of knowledge. But this is all wrong. Everything that is known is comprehended not according to its own nature, but according to the ability to know of those who do the knowing." And so the second argument here is essentially knowledge depends on the capacity of the knower and not the nature of the known. And we get the example that different parts of the psyche know things differently. The senses perceive, intelligence works things out, imagination knows its own creations. These are three completely different ways and capacities of knowing. Now, what's interesting here is how this idea converges with a lot of the contemporary theories of perception. For instance, it reminds me of Gibson's theory of affordances. That is, that we perceive objects not as kind of independent, existing physical entities, but rather with some function or meaning. For instance, when I see a chair, I perceive place to sit rather than perceiving an object that is a chair, which is made up of, rectangular legs and a square seat and a rectangular back. I don't actually perceive any of that stuff. What I perceive is place to sit, because the chair affords me a place to sit, hence affordances. There's also Wolfram's observer theory and Donald Hoffman's interface theory of perception and fitness beats truth theorem, Wheeler's observer participants. All of these lead to the conclusion that the physical order is perceived differently by different conscious agents depending on the capacities of those agents. And that includes what they need to perceive, the level of complexity, the level of detail, if there are survival fitness benefits factored in. And so in some sense, the observer actually gets into reality and helps render it, or at least renders it for itself in a way that substantially shapes what we know. There's a dialogue, a reciprocal function then, between the known and the knower, but consistent with Lady Philosophy's point, it very much depends on the capacity of the knower. There's also Carl Friston's free energy principle, which is the idea that we cannot perceive reality as it literally is, because reality is so complex and entropic that if we were to recreate that in our internal state through perception, we would dissolve. We couldn't handle it. And so we have to have something like, for instance, Donald Hoffman's interface theory of perception, by which we encode the complexity of reality into a simpler perceptual language, the physical order. We get the same idea in Bernardo Kastrup's analytic idealism with the dissociated alters who render the physical order based on their capacities, and a similar thing, although perhaps more into the spiritual community side of the philosophical internet, with Thomas Campbell's larger consciousness system and individuated units of consciousness. So that's a lot. It's not necessarily stuff you need to know to understand Boethius, but it's very interesting to see these ideas from Boethius that came from centuries and centuries ago, now bearing out in modern cognitive science, philosophy of mind, reality theory, ontology, metaphysics, so on and so forth. And so we see that connection continue, as Lady Philosophy says, the point of greatest importance is this: the superior manner of knowledge includes the inferior, but it is quite impossible for the inferior to rise to the superior. So again, we get the idea connecting to Hoffman, Wolfram, Wheeler, Kastrup, etc. Creation is an information system, and the physical order is rendered by consciousness following the code or the programming language, which is the logos. And each instance of a finite form, the inferior knowledge, instantiates its universal form, which is in the divine mind, which of course is the superior knowledge. So that would be the divine one for Plato or the Neoplatonic system, the Trinity for Christians, the Logos, obviously. The Logos is the second person, Christ. And so for an example of this, we can look to video games. So if you're playing Red Dead Redemption, you have a horse. That horse, as it's rendered on the screen for you, is an instance of capital H, horse, the game asset as a whole, from which all the horses in the game are instantiated or rendered. So your individual horse that renders for you is the inferior knowledge, and the capital H horse is the superior knowledge. So the idea here is, again, that difference between the transcendent, that is God, the level of the divine, and the level of the creation, that which is immanent, contingent, finite, limited. And because it's limited, and again consistent with Carl Friston's free energy principle, the mind has to render an imperfect instantiation of what in the divine is perfect. And so this gets to things like the Platonic forms, the divine ideas. All of this is based on our capacity to know, not just the nature of the objects that we know. So we can look at it similarly, again, back to the video game. that while we are within the game, while we are within the illusion, the material world, the rendered world, we can only perceive the lowercase h, horse, for example, that instantiates in front of us. We cannot perceive the capital H, horse, the superior version of it, from our perspective. So too with the events in our lives, we can't really understand Providence's view from within the material life. That's the difference between Providence and fate that she explained to us in Book 4. And so she sums this up. So you see, in their manner of knowing, they all use their own capacity to know, rather than the capacity to be known of the objects of their knowledge. And this is quite proper, for since every judgment is an action of the one who judges, it is necessary that each should perform its work by its own power, and not another's. She then gives a little critique of Stoicism, here at the beginning of the poetry section. The Stoics of the painted porch once taught obscure philosophers to think of things the senses learn as images impressed upon the mind from bodies round about, just as with swiftly moving pen it was the custom once to print upon the spreading sea of wax. So she's essentially denying this vision, which is kind of a Stoic materialism. And this is, again, as we see in modern theories of perception, that align with this sort of active mind that Boethius is advocating for here. We're dealing with a kind of idealism, which is consistent with Plato, also somewhat consistent with Aristotle, definitely with Neoplatonism, and in some senses with Christianity, although it's not a perfect fit. But again, the central idea is that the knower, the capacity of the knower, the properties of the knower are just as important, if not more important, than the object of knowledge. And this lends support to her argument, because remember that the soul's nature is as a spark of the divine. It inherits the free will or self-determinacy of the divine. And so in that sense, while its vision is finite, it can't get to the level of providence, it's stuck in the inferior knowledge, it is free from the kind of deterministic, materialistic system that Boethius is worried about. Because of its self-determinism, it is able to participate, and in a sense determine to an extent, that physical reality. The argument continues in chapter 5. She says, "Consider the case of beings which in their mode of perception are free from all corporeal influence. They can rouse their mind to activity without having to react to external stimuli. And then, a multiplicity of kinds of knowledge has been given to different substances. Mere sensation without any other kind of knowing has been given to animals that have no power of movement, like mussels and other shellfish, which grow on the rocks. Imagination has been given to animals which do have the power of movement, and which appear to have some will to choose or avoid things. Reason belongs to the human race, just as intelligence belongs only to the divinity. The result is that that kind of knowing transcends the others, which of its own nature knows not only its own objects, but also the objects of the other kinds of knowing." Now, we can set aside here for now debates about whether different animals have reason or intelligence, or, the specific use of terms here is not the point. The point is that there's a hierarchy of different capacities of knowledge, and that affects the way that these different entities know. So, she gives the hierarchy of sense, imagination, reason, and intelligence, and the intelligence that belongs to the divinity transcends the others and in a sense contains them and knows all the things that they know and all the ways of knowing that those entail. So again, we see this is very similar to those contemporary theories of perception. Different beings have different levels of noetic capacity, which manifests as sensation, imagination, reason, intelligence, God being the latter, and knowing all in all. So again, think of Wolfram's computational observers, each with a different computational capacity. Even theories like integrated information theory are starting to go in this direction, where consciousness is seen as this kind of continuum or spectrum, and the more complex the physical system is, the more consciousness can express through it, opening up a larger decision space, better able to predict and render the next state of reality. so on and so forth. All of this is actually quite resonant with the latest things in neuroscience, cognitive science, and philosophy of mind today. Absolutely fascinating that Boethius and, of course, the Hellenistic philosophers who influenced him were already tracking a lot of these ideas centuries ago. She then gives us another argument. She says this is how it runs. If anything does not seem to have any certain and predestined occurrence, it cannot be foreknown as a future event. Of such, therefore, there is no foreknowledge. And if we believe that, even in this case, there is foreknowledge, there will be nothing which does not happen of necessity. If, therefore, as beings who have a share of reason, we can judge of the mind of God, we should consider it most fitting for human reason to bow before divine wisdom, just as we judged it right for the senses and the imagination to yield to reason. Let us then, if we can, raise ourselves up to the heights of that supreme intelligence. There, reason will be able to see that which it cannot see by itself. It will be able to see how that which has no certain occurrence may be seen by a certain and fixed foreknowledge, a knowledge that is not opinion, but the boundless immediacy of the highest form of knowing. So based on that hierarchy that she gave, she essentially argues that just as sense bows to imagination, imagination bows to reason, so our reason, which is the level she gives humanity, should bow to intelligence, the level of God and providence. And this evokes the Christian concept of theosis, or the spiritual concept of ascension. That is, that as we ascend, that leads to greater capacity of knowing. So consciousness, the knower, the conscious agent, expands its noetic ability, and thus it's able to perceive or render for itself the higher realities, the higher perspective. And so we come closer to having the intelligence of God. In a Platonic sense, of course, this aligns with the idea that learning is remembering things that we knew pre-incarnation, because the soul had its divine nature and forgot that. So learning is remembering our divine nature, and therefore remembering the previous scope of knowing that we were able to perform and returning to that capacity. To round out chapter 5, we get these lines of poetry. This picture warns, except to witless earthbound men. You who raise your eyes to heaven with thrusting face, raise up as well your thoughts, lest weighted down to earth, your mind sink lower as your body rises high. So in other words, once you get to the level of reason or humanity, you also have the burden of choice. You get to choose whether you want to be weighted down, caught in the illusion, or if you want to turn your attention up high and ascend. This calls back to the Orpheus and Eurydice myth, where, of course, Orpheus looks back into the darkness of the underworld to catch a glimpse at Eurydice, and she is pulled back into that darkness, whereas what he should have done was keep his gaze on the light ahead and continue to ascend without looking back. And now we come to the final chapter in the Consolation of Philosophy, and as we'll see, this chapter settles a lot of the modern theist-atheist debates, specifically on the topic of free will versus determinism. So we get the start of chapter 6. Lady Philosophy says, "In this life of today, you do not live more fully than in that fleeting and transitory moment. Whatever therefore suffers the condition of being in time, even though it never had any beginning, never has any ending, and its life extends into the infinity of time, as Aristotle thought was the case of the world. It is still not such that it may properly be considered eternal. Its life may be infinitely long, but it does not embrace and comprehend its whole extent simultaneously. It still lacks the future, while already having lost the past, so that that which embraces and possesses simultaneously the whole fullness of everlasting life, which lacks nothing of the future and has lost nothing of the past, that is what may properly be said to be eternal. Of necessity it will always be present to itself, controlling itself, and have present the infinity of fleeting time." So as I said before, here is the difference between being eternal and being immortal, and why God cannot be said to exist, that he is even transcendent of existence, and he is definitely transcendent of space and time. So for example, because he is transcendent of time, God is truly eternal. He accesses past, present, and future as the eternal present. This is different from an immortal being, which is still locked within time. They are always in their present, but they have always lost the past and can never get back to it, and the future is always out of their grasp until it arrives as their present. This is very different from the eternality and transcendence of God's perspective. And so a lot of paradoxes and problems arise if, as modern theism and atheism often do in their debates with each other, we bring God down to the level of, for instance, the highest being with a lowercase b that exists, or that lasts across all of time, or is present throughout all of space, or who knows all of the knowledge within space and time, or within all minds, in a finite sense. We bring him down from the transcendent into the creation, and then debate about whether there's empirical evidence for God existing, as if we could find his house on a mountain somewhere. When again, the actual traditional conception of God, and in some sense it's based on Aristotle, is that he is transcendent of all these things, and so he cannot be defined by existence, by being, or by their dual opposites, non-existence or non-being. He's transcendent of even the term exist. And she says as much with the lines, God ought not to be considered as older than the created world in extent of time, but rather in the property of the immediacy of his nature. The infinite changing of things in time is an attempt to imitate this state of the presence of unchanging life, but since it cannot portray or equal that state, it falls from sameness into change, from the immediacy of presence into the infinite extent of past and future. So again, note how different this is from the modern debates between Christians and atheists over, did God create the world, or did the world just exist eternally? Did it come from the Big Bang? All of those questions are irrelevant in this model because it's a mistake to put God into time and see him as before in a sequence the world. He has to be transcendent. The world exists out of him. Ex sistere is the root of the word existence, and that means to stand out from. So the immanent always stands out from the transcendent. It's not that the transcendent steps into the immanent, comes prior to it in the sequence of time, and then initiates creation from within space and time. That is an incoherent view. That is not Christianity, although to listen to a lot of the debates, that is kind of the viewpoint that both the theist and the atheist take. And ironically, in that sense, their views are not all that dissimilar from one another. What we've lost, essentially, then, in modern Christianity is the apophatic attitude that we keep coming back to in favor of a more analytic or reductionist or positivist attitude, and that simply does not fit. It leads to a lot of the same problems that Boethius here is encountering with the objections that he raised and that Lady Philosophy is now correcting. And we get a few more lines about this a little further down, where she makes these distinctions. God is eternal, but the world is perpetual. So again, perpetual implies that it's within time. Eternal implies that it's transcendent of time itself. His knowledge, too, transcends all temporal change and abides in the immediacy of his presence. So, in other words, he's in the eternal present. He's not within our conception of the past, present, and future as a sequence. And then she says, so that it is better called providence or looking forth than provision or seeing beforehand. This divine foreknowledge does not change the nature and property of things. It simply sees things present to it exactly as they will happen at some time as future events. So it's not even really foreknowledge, because for him, God, it's present knowledge. It just happens to be what we perceive as future, but fundamentally there is only the eternal present. There is only the eternal now. She says, in the same way, the divine gaze looks down on all things without disturbing their nature. To him they are present things, but under the condition of time they are future things. And so it comes about that when God knows that something is going to occur, and knows that no necessity to be is imposed upon it, it is not opinion, but rather knowledge founded upon truth. And so the argument she's making here is that because he is eternal, and providence operates outside of time completely, God knows what we perceive as future in his eternal present, and thus this does not need a deterministic series of events in order for him to know things. As such, we can have free will, and he can still know what the outcome is going to be. Continuing on, she says, and so those things which are present to God will without doubt happen, but some of them result from the necessity of things, and some of them from the power of those who do them. We are not wrong, therefore, to say that if these things are considered with reference to divine foreknowledge, they are necessary, but if they are considered by themselves, they are free from the bonds of necessity, just as everything that the senses perceive is universal if considered with reference to the reason, but individual if considered in itself. So another way we can look at this distinction between the transcendent and the immanent is with things like universal laws. So the law of conservation of momentum applies everywhere in the physical universe, but it gets instantiated when there are objects moving. Similarly, the laws of English grammar apply everywhere that the language of English exists, that is, in all minds that know English. But it's only instantiated once someone who knows the language writes a sentence, speaks a sentence, reads a sentence, and then that law of grammar is instantiated with a sentence, paragraph, whatever it might be. So again, you have something that is transcendent of the instantiations, and then you have the instantiations which participate in the transcendence. And so it is with this insight on the transcendent versus the immanent that Lady Philosophy gives us the parting words of the Consolation of Philosophy, the last thing that Boethius will leave us with. We get the lines, so that the difficulty you put forward a short time ago, that it was unfitting if our future is said to provide a cause of God's knowledge, is solved. The power of this knowledge, which embraces all things in present understanding, has itself established the mode of being for all things, and owes nothing to anything secondary to itself. And since this is so, man's freedom of will remains inviolate, and the law does not impose reward and punishment unfairly, because the will is free from all necessity. God has foreknowledge, and rests a spectator from on high of all things, and as the ever-present eternity of his vision dispenses reward to the good and punishment to the bad, it adapts itself to the future quality of our actions. Hope is not placed in God in vain, and prayers are not made in vain, for if they are the right kind, they cannot but be efficacious. Avoid vice, therefore, and cultivate virtue. Lift up your mind to the right kind of hope, and put forth humble prayers on high. A great necessity is laid upon you, if you will be honest with yourself, a great necessity to be good, since you live in the sight of a judge who sees all things. And so, if I had to summarize the Consolation of Philosophy, the way to live a good and meaningful life, the consolation of our existence, comes down to having a relationship with the transcendence, remembering your connection to the transcendence, partaking and participating in the transcendence. It's a rejection of the materialism and physicalism that are the philosophies of the illusion and that deny transcendence. It's not uncommon, for instance, for philosophers of those ontologies today to deny the existence of consciousness itself. Many of them also explicitly reject metaphysics as a whole, even though physicalism is a metaphysical position. And there's also a rejection usually of epistemology, especially when it requires things like objective truth. They prefer things like pragmatism, which rejects all of that. It is an attempt at an epistemology that denies epistemology. The result of those kinds of philosophies is that they destroy any sense of meaning. They wipe out any purpose. They end in nihilism. And the reason they do is because they deny the transcendent. All of Lady Philosophy's arguments point us to the transcendent. The soul must remember its divine nature, and it does this by constantly keeping its noetic eye fixated upwards, the point of its ascension, rather than looking back into the darkness of the illusion. Whether you take the Platonic or Neoplatonic view of how this happens, or the economy of the sun and spirit in Christianity, or however you want to look at it, this is pretty much a perennial spiritual philosophy and examination of the human experience on this planet. You find it in those systems, you find it in Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism. Most spiritual traditions revolve around this dynamic between the creation and the transcendent in some way, and navigating that relationship with practices that bring us, through direct participation, into communion with the divine, rather than just keeping us at the level of abstract intellectual philosophy. And so the Consolation of Philosophy is actually an argument to transcend philosophy itself, and there's quite a bit of beauty in that. And with that, we have concluded The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. I want to say thank you very much for joining me for this series. If you stuck with me through all these hour-long lectures, that's fantastic. And I hope that you got a lot out of this book. It's one of my absolute favorites, and I'm always amazed at how much of Boethius's message resonates across the centuries. This is also by no means the only series of this scope that we will do on the channel. I have other books planned as well, so make sure you subscribe for more and hit that bell icon so you'll get notified when the next videos drop and we start our next series. For now, thank you again for joining me, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye-bye.